The morning air in Charleston, South Carolina, hung heavy with the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine, but inside the sprawling, meticulously preserved historic mansion of Margaret Rodriguez, the atmosphere was perpetually cold, sterile, and unforgiving. Margaret, at 74, was a titan of the city's old money, a retired federal judge whose name still commanded respect and fear in equal measure. She lived in a world dictated by absolute order, a stark contrast to the beautiful chaos of the surrounding city. Her personal life, however, was a revolving door of exasperated staff, specifically the living caretakers meant to assist her after a severe, life-altering stroke 3 years prior. This was not a job for the faint of heart. Her requirement for punctuality, precision, and silent efficiency was legendary, or rather, infamous. The staff turnover rate at the Rodriguez estate was so astronomical that local agencies had started charging a hazard fee, and the running joke among domestic workers was that no employee had managed to endure a full 7-day cycle. Margaret herself often referred to the procession of caretakers as temporary annoyances, quickly dismissing them with a scathing critique of their lack of commitment, their clumsy disregard for her antique Chinese porcelain, or, most frequently, their inability to simply anticipate her needs before she had to articulate them. The stroke had left her physically compromised, needing assistance with mobility and complex tasks, yet intellectually she remained raised, her mind a steel trap, making her demands all the more difficult to satisfy. The true root of her rigidity was the abandonment she felt after her children grown and established on the West Coast insisted on placing her in a facility, a suggestion she met with such icy fury that it fractured their already distant relationship. This deep-seated fear of being seen as helpless or disposable fueled her tyrannical need for control over her immediate environment. Into this crucible stepped Daniel Lopez, 32 years old, a former captain in the Charleston Fire Department who had recently taken a forced temporary leave of absence following a traumatic incident during a 3-alarm fire that had resulted in the loss of one of his junior colleagues. Daniel, a man built like an oak and used to the adrenaline-fueled necessity of quick, decisive action, was now adrift, battling insomnia and survivor's guilt. The quiet, repetitive tasks of caretaking were the antithesis of his high-stakes career, but his department's internal affairs officer, a kindly, pragmatic woman named Cynthia Ramirez, had strongly recommended he take a low-structured environment job as a form of occupational therapy, a complete break from the heat and the urgency. The AD for the Rodriguez estate was vague, promising high pay and demanding discretion, exactly what Daniel needed. Isolation and a task that required physical strength, but zero mental calculation under pressure. He had no idea of Margaret's reputation, believing it was simply a rich, elderly woman requiring simple support. The agency, desperate to fill the slot, had conveniently omitted the part about the previous 17 caretakers leaving within 3 weeks. Daniel arrived on a Tuesday morning, 10 minutes early, a fact that already put him ahead of most predecessors. He was met not by Margaret, but by Betty Wilson, Margaret's long-suffering, loyal administrative assistant and the mansion's de facto buffer. Betty, small and bird-like with perpetually anxious eyes, gave Daniel a tour, whispering warnings and pointers like a battlefield guide. Judge Rodriguez appreciates silence, Mr. Lopez, and never, ever move the antique telescope in the sunroom. It belonged to her late husband, Admiral Rodriguez, and she believes it is the source of all good fortune, Betty cautioned, her voice barely audible. The mansion was a museum, every object positioned with deliberate, historical weight. Daniel's first interaction with Margaret was during her prescribed 10 o'clock medication schedule. He knocked softly on the door of the study, a mahogany-paneled room smelling faintly of leather and old books. Margaret sat behind a massive desk, her wheelchair positioned precisely so she could look out onto the perfect, geometric symmetry of the formal gardens. She was dressed in an immaculately tailored silk dressing gown, her white hair coiled into a severe bun, and her gaze, when she turned it on Daniel, was like a physical reprimand. "You are 3 minutes and 20 seconds late, according to my chronometer," she stated, her voice a low, gravelly timbre that betrayed no emotion, only fact. Daniel used too much higher stakes, didn't flinch. "Apologies, Judge Rodriguez." Betty was explaining the intricate locking mechanism on the liquor cabinet. He placed the small tray with her medications, labeled and timed, precisely at the edge of the desk. She eyed the tray, then him, Lopez, a firefighter. "Your dossier suggests you thrive on instability. I require stability," she challenged, clearly trying to provoke a defensive reaction to immediately establish demeanor. Daniel met her gaze evenly. "I'll ensure the fire never starts, ma'am." His calmness, his lack of desperate eagerness to please, seemed to momentarily throw her. The conversation ended there, but the first spark of conflict, the clash between Margaret's rigid, controlling need for silent perfection and Daniel's trained, life-saving instinct for necessary noise and immediate, even blunt, action, was struck. The next few days were a sustained, low-intensity war of attrition. Daniel performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, but his background kept bleeding through the cracks of the job description. Margaret demanded her soup at precisely 12:45 p.m., no later. One day, the antique silver soup tureen handle became lodged, forcing Daniel to exert unusual strength, resulting in a loud metallic clang that echoed through the silent dining room. Margaret dropped her napkin in shock. She hissed. Daniel simply replied, "The alternative was burned fingers and spilled soup, Judge." He didn't apologize, merely stated the functional necessity, this refusal to crumble under her scrutiny. A trait she was used to leveraging to immediately dismiss staff fascinated and infuriated her. He once noticed an electrical flicker near her bedroom outlet, an insignificant detail to the untrained eye, but a potential hazard to a seasoned firefighter. Without consulting her, he immediately called an electrician, disrupting her afternoon reading by 20 minutes. She was livid. "You took unauthorized initiative," she railed. Daniel stood firm. It was a safety hazard. Judge Rodriguez, the true beginning of the emotional conflict came on the fourth day. Daniel found Margaret in the sunroom, struggling silently to reach a heavy, leather-bound volume high on a shelf or book of her late husband's naval strategies. She was fighting the paralysis, her face a mask of strain and frustration, refusing the call for help, unwilling to admit the limitation. Daniel watched for a moment, seeing not the imperious judge, but the frightened, abandoned old woman. He walked over slowly, gently pushed her chair back a foot, and retrieved the book without a word. As he handed it to her, his hand briefly brushed hers. He noticed a faint tremor, a vulnerability she tried desperately to conceal. She snatched the book away, her eyes glistening slightly, a mix of shame and rage. "Do not pity me, Lopez. I will not tolerate pity," she whispered fiercely. Daniel's response was unexpected. Pity is for victims. Judge Jordeas, he saw a fighter, just one whose battleground had shifted from the courtroom to a 4,000-square-foot prison of her own making. The underlying narrative of abandonment, which Daniel understood perhaps better than anyone because of his own feeling of failing his crew, had begun to resonate. He wasn't just working a job. He was slowly chipping away at the fortress she had built around her heart. The first week was almost over. Margaret had not yet found a reason compelling enough to fire him, and Daniel, surprisingly, felt a perverse sense of Machina's small challenge to conquer his own feelings of uselessness. He realized that beneath the judge's cold exterior lay a fierce, almost desperate yearning for genuine human connection, masked by the cruelty she used to push everyone away before they could leave on their own terms. He was starting to see the emotional fire she was battling inside, the isolation caused by her stroke and the subsequent distance from her family. This realization changed his approach from mechanical efficiency to quiet, empathetic engagement, though still maintaining his strict professional boundaries. He found himself thinking about her complex loneliness while staring out the sunroom window at the perfect, yet lifeless, garden. The script had been set, a man seeking redemption through silent duty and a woman seeking human connection through aggressive dismissal. The tension was palpable, waiting for the pivotal event that would either send Daniel packing or shatter Margaret's iron control. The first 7 days were winding down, and the house still had an unexpected employee. The second week saw the subtle shifts solidify into a true, albeit volatile, relationship. Daniel, having survived the initial purge, was now viewed by Margaret not as a temporary annoyance, but as a persistent, immovable, object-to-new challenge to her authority. His fire department training manifested in an unexpected, almost ritualistic way. He began creating an internal hazard assessment of her needs, not just for safety, but for emotional well-being. He noticed the days she seemed to crave more social interaction, often coinciding with days she wore a particular emerald brooch, a gift from her estranged daughter, and the days she demanded absolute isolation. He adjusted the volume of his movements, the pitch of his voice, and the length of his necessary intrusions accordingly. This silent responsiveness, born not of fear but of trained observation, was a concept utterly foreign to Margaret, who was accustomed to people either groveling or fleeing. The escalating conflict came not from a mistake, but from a deliberate choice Daniel made regarding Margaret's physical therapy. The physical therapist, Sandra Thomas, a woman in her late 40s, had prescribed a complex weight-bearing exercise that involved Margaret lifting herself a few inches out of her chair and holding the position for grueling, painful tasks that often ended in tears of frustration. Margaret's proud facade always crumbled during these sessions, and she had developed a habit of refusing to cooperate on Thursdays, the day she hosted a virtual meeting with the board of the Rodriguez Foundation, viewing any sign of physical weakness as a professional liability. On the third Thursday of Daniel's tenure, Margaret issued her refusal with steely finality. "Tell Dr. Thomas I am indisposed, Lopez." Instead of relaying the message, Daniel wheeled her chair away from the desk, towards the sunroom where the afternoon light was strongest. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stated a fact, using the same measured, authoritative tone he once reserved for demanding action from his crew during a structure fire. "Judge Rodriguez, you may be indisposed, but your body is not. You told me on Tuesday that the only thing you regret in your life is the paralysis that stopped you from seeing your granddaughter, Kimberly White, graduate from an app. This physical therapy is the only fire exit from that regret. We are not skipping it." Sight 1-3, his words, sharp and devoid of the saccharine deference she usually received, hit her like a punch. He wasn't talking about obedience. He was talking about agency and overcoming. He had weaponized her own ambition and desire against her, a move she recognized from her own courtroom tactics. The reference to her granddaughter, Kimberly White, whom she hadn't seen in over 2 years due to the acrimony with her son, was a direct strike at her deepest point of vulnerability. The pain of abandonment and the fear that her legacy would be defined by her immobility and bitterness, not her decades of legal achievement. She was speechless for a long moment, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed to slits. Finally, she exhaled a sharp, shuddering breath. "The weight limit on your contract is not for lifting my spirits, Sopej," she scoffed, but there was a tremor in her voice. Daniel simply brought the specialized rail to her side and adjusted the harness. She completed the exercise, every second an agonizing testament to her stubbornness. She didn't thank him. She simply demanded a clean glass of spring water. But as he moved away, he caught a flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't gratitude, but a profound, almost terrifying respect. He had forced her to confront her own weakness and, in doing so, had offered her a sliver of hope. The emotional deepening accelerated the following Saturday. Daniel was meticulously cleaning the attic, a part of the house Betty usually kept locked, when he discovered a dusty trunk containing personal effects. The letters were from her older brother, Thomas Rodriguez, a Navy pilot who had died heroically 43 years ago in a training accident. Later that evening, while preparing her dinner, Daniel carefully brought the doll and one of the letters downstairs, placing them on her nightstand without comment. He didn't want to pry. He just wanted to acknowledge the hidden grief he sensed. When Margaret saw them, her composure finally, spectacularly broke. She didn't scream or rage. She simply stared at the doll, her hand trembling as she reached for the faded paper. Tears, the first Daniel had ever seen her shed, ran silent, hot paths down her cheeks, leaving temporary marks on the proud, unyielding face. This was the turning point. Daniel sat beside her chair, not as a caretaker, but as an equal who understood loss. He spoke softly, sharing the trauma he was running from the night his colleague Jason Sachs was lost and the subsequent tidal wave of guilt. We all have people who leave us, Judge, sometimes by fire, sometimes by choice, sometimes by accident. The worst part is always the sound of their promises echoing in the silence. You've let your children's choice to leave define your whole life, turning the mansion into a fortress against the possibility of being hurt again. He didn't offer platitudes about moving on, but about accepting the injustice of loss and choosing to live despite it. He spoke the language of raw, shared pain. Margaret was momentarily stripped bare, the judge replaced by the grieving little sister. She confessed haltingly how she had driven her children away with her demands and criticisms, fearing that if they stayed, they would eventually fail her. Just like Thomas did not by choice, but by fate. She realized the stroke, which had stolen her physical control, had ironically forced her to seek help, exposing her fear of vulnerability. Daniel had not only kept his promise to her by not quitting, but by recognizing the meaning of the doll and the letters. He had unintentionally honored Thomas's promise to her. The emotional resolution wasn't immediate, but the dynamic fundamentally shifted. Margaret started listening to Daniel, not just to criticize, but to hear him. She began to appreciate the stability he provided, not as an absence of noise, but as a reliable presence against the storm of her internal grief. The emotional contract was signed. He would fight her physical inertia, and she would challenge his emotional paralysis. Their shared pain over abandonment and their parallel journeys toward overcoming their respective traumas became the foundation of an unlikely, unbreakable bond, paving the way for the climax. We've reached a significant point of emotional vulnerability and character development. If you're enjoying the journey of Daniel and Margaret and this unexpected, powerful connection being forged in the quiet rooms of a Charleston mansion, please consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps us continue telling these deeply human stories of resilience and new beginnings. Now, for our interaction, I want to ask you, what do you think is the biggest fire Margaret needs to put out in her life? Is it her bitterness, her fear of being helpless, or her inability to forgive her family? Share your thoughts below. The climax arrived suddenly, an abrupt and terrifying interruption to the mansion's carefully curated peace, mirroring the destructive force of the event that had derailed Daniel's career. It was a late Sunday afternoon during one of the city's unseasonable late November thunderstorms. A fierce lightning strike hit a massive old live oak tree near the estate's power line, causing a sharp, metallic smell of burning ozone and a momentary, total blackout. In the ensuing silence, the backup generator failed to kick on. For Margaret, the sudden darkness and silence were instantly debilitating. She was alone in the library, attempting a difficult cognitive exercise Dr. Thomas had set for her. The total absence of light and sound triggered a severe panic attack, a known side effect of her stroke trauma. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her heart rate spiked dangerously, and she slid halfway out of her wheelchair, caught precariously by the safety belt. Unable to fully right herself or call out a vision of absolute helplessness. Daniel, who had been in the kitchen, heard the crack of the lightning and the resulting power surge silence. His firefighter instinct immediately took over, overriding the lingering guilt and the exhaustion of his forced occupational break. He didn't use a flashlight. He knew the house's layout by heart, having mentally mapped all possible escape routes and hazards during his first week. He moved with the precision and speed of someone who thrives in chaos. The first true return to his element since Jason Sanchez's death. He found Margaret in the library, gasping, half fallen, her face contorted in a silent scream of fear and effort. The emergency call device was just inches from her trembling hand, unreachable. Daniel didn't try to lift her, which could cause injury. Instead, he spoke to her, his voice low, steady, and intensely focused, the voice of a commanding officer in a smoke-filled room. Judge Rodriguez, listen to me. This is not a courtroom. This is not a fire. This is just a storm. I need you to focus on my voice. You are safe. You are not alone. I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Focus on one breath. In, hold for 3 seconds. Ouchie, slow. Your name is Margaret Rodriguez. You are a retired judge, and I am Hiri. Now, use your left arm push against the wheel, not the chair. I have you. He physically stabilized her, but his words addressed her panic and her deep-seated fear of being utterly abandoned and helpless. He forced her to reassert her identity and strength in the face of physical limitation. Over 3 agonizing minutes, he coached her through the panic, moving her safely back into the chair, the sheer force of his presence and command structure overriding her terror. When she was fully upright and her breathing had normalized, the power flickered back on, bathing the room in harsh, sudden light. The danger was past, but the emotional resolution was yet to come. Margaret stared at Daniel, tears now of profound relief and a dawning understanding. He had seen her at her weakest, her most vulnerable, and instead of leaving, he had taken control and saved her not from a fire, but from the paralysis of fear. She reached out and grasped his hand, a gesture of naked, unfiltered emotion she had not allowed herself in years. Lopez, she said, her voice clear now, but fragile, you didn't just prevent the fire. Daniel, still vibrating with the adrenaline of the rescue, felt the concrete wall he had built around his own guilt finally crack. He saw, in Margaret's face, a reflection of the profound forgiveness he had been denying himself. He realized that saving a life, even a life that was just suffocating under its own weight of grief and bitterness, was a form of redemption. The lesson learned from this climax was twofold. Margaret realized that true strength lies in accepting help and vulnerability, and Daniel understood that his instinct to save others was not a flaw, but his true unshakable purpose, finally allowing him to process the trauma of his past. The emotional resolution continued over the next few weeks. Margaret, finally understanding the source of her own loneliness, reached out to her son, Richard Davies, and scheduled a visit for the following month. She began to treat Betty Wilson not as a subordinate, but as a true companion. And as for Daniel, his temporary leave was ending. He told Margaret he would be returning to the Charleston Fire Department, no longer haunted by his past, but strengthened by the unlikely relationship they had forged. Margaret's parting gift was not money, but a single, heavy, leather-bound book, the Naval Strategies volume he had retrieved for her. Inside, she had inscribed a single line: "Captain Lopez, your true command is not over fire, but over fear. Thank you for showing me the way through the smoke." He had not lasted just a week. He had fundamentally changed the structure of her solitary life, achieving a victory more meaningful than any he'd had fighting physical flames. He stepped out of the mansion and back into the humid Charleston air, no longer a broken firefighter on leave, but a redeemed man with a renewed sense of purpose, ready for a new beginning. If you enjoyed witnessing Daniel and Margaret's journey of healing and mutual redemption, we invite you to subscribe and join our community. We love sharing narratives of overcoming and the deep emotional bonds that define us. Tell us, which city are you watching our stories from? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video and the story of Daniel and Margaret? More importantly, what is the single most important thing you learned from their journey about the power of showing up for someone else?